about the third paragraph down, because the subject of biblical covenants and ancient treaties has been under intensive investigation and lively dispute, some introductory observations are in order now about these biblical arrangements we call covenants. Our chief interest, of course, is in those covenantal arrangements in which God was one party. There are other covenants mentioned in the Bible which God is not a particular party, and of course there are all kinds of covenants outside the Bible which God, or at least the true God, is not a party. But we're interested especially in those covenants, biblical covenants, of which God himself was one of the parties to the covenant. So in the Hebrew, of course, you know that the word Berith is covenant. And the New Testament translators, when they wanted to express what they understood to be the proper equivalent of Berith, they used the term Diatheke. So our question then is, what is it that constitutes the peculiar Berith character of that which is so denominated? Certain arrangements are called Berith. What is it about them that justifies that particular term? In other words, what does Berith mean then? And this could sound like a very difficult and profound, complex question, but it needn't be. I think it can be quite simple. You take out your concordance, you look in the concordance of the usages of Berith or Diatheke, covenant, and just see what the context are saying about the Berith. And what you'll find that over and over again, a Berith is something that is made. They make a Berith. And how do they make it? You read the context a little more, and you find that they make the covenant by a process of solemn ratification, we might say, or promulgation. Very often, perhaps characteristically, we might say, this Berith-making transaction centers in the swearing of an oath. So the idea of an oath is very close to the heart of what we're talking about when we're talking about a Berith. An oath, and along with the commitment of the oath, of course, the sanction that is attached to it. An oath is of course, a commitment made under heaven in which you invoke upon yourself certain sanctions, especially in the case that you will prove faithless to your oath commitment, that you are invoking a curse sanction upon yourself. So in a way, an oath is a kind of conditional self-malediction. You are invoking a malediction, a curse upon yourself under the condition that you violate this solemn commitment that you are making. So that's the kind of a procedure, this oath-taking thing that is featured in the making of a covenant. So clearly, just from these on the surface observations, a Berith is a legal kind of arrangement. It's a formal disposition of a binding nature. All right? It's a legal kind of arrangement, a formal disposition of a binding nature. And at the heart of a Berith is an act of commitment, and the customary oath form of this commitment reveals the religious nature of this transaction. An oath, after all, is a taking of the name of God. It's a commitment made with God as witness and enforcer of the whole deal. And so the Berith arrangement, all right, the next paragraph then pretty much gives the essential definition. The kind of legal disposition called Berith consists then in a divinely sanctioned commitment. Now that's the heart of the idea, a divinely sanctioned commitment, a commitment solemnly made, often through oath, in the presence of God, and with the recognition, anticipation that he is the one who will enforce the sanctions you have invoked. May God do so to me and more also if I don't keep this. Okay, that's what's going on here. Divinely sanctioned commitment. When you're talking about divine human covenants, then, what's the divine sanctioning and consist in? The divine sanctioning here is entailed in God's participation in the thing in one of two ways. God participates in this solemn commitment either as the one who himself makes the commitment, and there are places where he makes the solemn commitment, of course, to us, and so there it has divine sanctioning, of course, because he is the one who makes it, and so on. Or in other cases, God participates in the arrangement as the divine witness, as we were saying. He has the witness of man makes the commitment, and God is the divine witness of that human commitment made in his name and presence. So that's the essential idea that I think is clearly there. And now we just add a few other indications that that's the right idea from noting terms that are sort of synonymous with covenant in the Bible, or other things that are said about covenants. We said that very often it will speak about making a covenant. Well, just over and over again, where the word covenant appears, the predication connected with it is that you either keep it or you break it. So a covenant is something which is remembered or forgotten, that is observed or honored, or that it is dishonored and violated. In fact, the two possible ways of treating a bereaved by observing or violating it are the most conspicuous and pervasive ideas found in the immediate association with that term in the Bible. You can just see for yourself that is so. Another common synonym for bereaved is the Hebrew word chesed, an interesting word, sometimes translated loving kindness and so, but which has perhaps the primary force of loyalty or fidelity. So a bereaved involves the idea, properly observed certainly, of keeping it, of being true to it, of chesed, of faithfulness, and especially when we're talking about God's relation to a covenant, it's God's chesed, his faithfulness is repeatedly brought out. Likewise, pointing to the centrality of commitment, and specifically of oath commitment in a bereaved arrangement, is the common use of words for curse or oath. That's what we would expect from the central role of an oath in supporting the sanctioning the commitment, and so as a synonym for bereaved, you'll have some Hebrew word like Allah, which means a curse, or shivuah, which means an oath. And I give us an example, Deuteronomy 29, verse 12. You stand here, says Moses. This is that solemn scene in the 29th chapter of Deuteronomy where Moses in the plains of Moab, 40 years after the original making of the covenant, they're about to enter the land. He's renewing the covenant, and he gathers all the people to do that which you do when you make a covenant. Here Israel is the one who's taking the oath of significance, as we'll see, because what it says about what is the principle that governs this covenant when it is the human party that solemnizes it by a human oath. But Moses now brings together the men, women, and children. You're all standing here. He says, this day you stand here to enter into the Berith, the covenant of Yahweh your God, and into the Allah, the oath curse, which Yahweh your God is making with you this day. So the oath curse is the synonym for the Berith, and other evidence to the same effect. And then this observation about the expression in Hebrew. Those of you who have had some Hebrew know the idiom in Hebrew for to make a covenant, and it's the expression karat, to cut a covenant. Now that's interesting. That's interesting because you would think a covenant would somehow express the idea of bonding somehow, but cutting a covenant, how does that occur? Well, it arises once again in terms of the central role played by the oath in solemnizing a covenant, because the oath would be very often not just a verbalization of the ideas, but it would involve a dramatization of it as well. There would be some ritual. There would be some ritual enacting of the curse. I swear to do so and so, and if I don't, then you could cut your throat in a gesture. We would often make that gesture. Then may God do so to me. And the so would be spelled out by some little ritual action that you would perform. Well, instead of crossing the hand across the throat like that, the characteristic ritual was that you take an animal and you kill it and you cut it up in parts. Okay? So may God do so to me, or also you cut up an animal in order to portray the curse sanction that you are, the malediction, the self-malediction that you are invoking upon yourself. And so to make a covenant became to the expression to cut a covenant. All of this just circles around the one central idea, confirming it, that a berith then is a matter of solemn, very often oath-bound commitments with divine sanctioning. Etymology is uncertain. We need to discuss it a great deal. Likely etymology of the berith might be associated with the word bond in the sense of obligations. When you undertake a commitment, that's an obligation that you are committed to, and you are bound, you see, in that sense of a bond. And that may well be the etymology of the word. In any case, then, the New Testament, the choice, as we've seen, the New Testament authors, when they're trying to bring out what they perceive to be the significance of berith, they use the word diatheke. And so we can look at the word diatheke, and that helps us somewhat. The diatheke means a disposition, especially in the extra-biblical usage, a last will and testament. And its use as a rendering for berith points to an understanding of the berith, too, as a solemnly transacted commitment, like a last will and testament, like a diatheke. Now, there's one other line of evidence which I want to develop at some length presently, and it has to do with this fascinating thing that began to emerge some 40 years or so ago in Old Testament studies with respect to covenants, not only then in the Bible, but in the ancient Near Eastern world. And what emerged at that time then was the fact that here in the sphere of international diplomacy, as various kingdoms were relating to one another in the Near East, that international diplomacy often came to documentary expression in the form of treaties. And depending on what the relationship of the two royal parties to the arrangement, if they were equals, then there'd be a sort of a parity treaty. And the ones we're especially interested in as providing parallels to the biblical phenomenon of God dealing with Israel, there are those arrangements in which the two covenant-making kings were by no means equal. One would be the sovereign, the suzerain, the great king, and the other would be the servant king, the vassal king, the subordinate one. And so what we then proceeded to discover was that as you examine these extra-biblical treaties, that they exhibited in rather remarkable detail the legal documentary form of certain biblical covenants, such as, for example, what we usually call the Ten Commandments or the Book of Deuteronomy. And so the original observations on this resulted from some doctoral dissertations that have been done on the study of the Hittite treaties. The Hittites up in Anatolia, the area of Asia Minor there in the days of Moses and so on. And from the archives of the Hittite kings, who were powerful kings at that time with neighboring vassal kings, then there were recovered some dozens, I guess, of treaties, and these were analyzed. And then the article that sort of popularized the thing right away was one by George Mendenhall, I guess, then of Michigan State. And he wrote some articles in the Biblical Archaeologist, which were then collected and developed. But what he was trying to point out then was that this treaty pattern, or rather, we'll be talking about this rather complex treaty pattern of the classic period of the third quarter of the second millennium BC, contained all kinds of overall and detailed parallels, correspondences, as we said, to Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy and elsewhere. Mendenhall did not bring Deuteronomy into the picture. He was dealing with Exodus 20 and Joshua 24 Joshua 24 has a covenant renewal ceremony that Joshua conducts his life is approaching an end, and as he puts things in order within the house of God that he is ruling over. But not Deuteronomy. Now, the first time this had just come out, and I read that stuff, and right away this thing had the ring of truth to me that these were real parallels, but what hit me right away was this is what the book of Deuteronomy is. Then this is what the outline of the book, and no one was saying this, and why not? And but the first thing, then so I wrote a couple of articles in the Westminster Journal, and they will constitute. Let's see, in the structure of biblical authority, part 2. I guess the first 2 chapters are essay in part 2, which are part of your required reading. So many of you have probably already read this. I hope you have, as a matter of fact. And so I wrote 2 articles. One had to do with a feature of the parallelism between the biblical phenomena in the Decalogue and these extra biblical treaties that hadn't been observed. That I think nailed down the fact that God actually was making use of that particular form in his dealings with Israel. And then the second article I wrote soon afterwards was to try to show that this pattern did in fact explain the whole structure of the book of Deuteronomy, and the implications of the latter for the higher criticism of the Pentateuch were, I think, devastating, and I think that is part of why the world of liberal critical scholarship had not seen or had some sort of a blindness set in that kept them from seeing that here is what the nature of the book of Deuteronomy was, that it corresponded to these second millennium treaties and so on, when modern criticism was not wanting to date the book of Deuteronomy in the second millennium, but now in the first millennium. So that's part of the whole story. But in any case, we'll be dealing then with those 2. Since then, everyone gets on the bandwagon and talks about this. And in fact, by now, decades later, yes, such things do. You get into the reactionaries who are trying to minimize what all of this is. You can judge for yourself. Now, my point here is this. Here are these extra biblical phenomena having to do with the administration of kingdoms, like God's kingdom of Israel. And with all of these parallels, and not only, by the way, in the documentary form, but in the ritual procedures connected with the covenant ratification, and beyond that, with ongoing administrative procedures like covenant renewal and the conduct of lawsuits of the suzerain against the vassal when the vassal would be breaking. There's a whole scheme, not only of documentary, but of administrative and ritualistic parallels between the two. And so the question is, what did they call those things? How did they perceive those things? What they call them are bonds and oaths. These things that are so much like the biblical phenomenon are named in the world of the time in terms of their character of being obligations that were imposed or undertaken, oath-bound obligations. So there's that whole line of evidence that supports the more readily available biblical data that we've just surveyed. Now, I'll pick that up in a moment. So now, if you're looking at Kingdom Prologue, there's a big long paragraph on the bottom of page 2 that I don't think need to work through at that time. Please read it. It does mention the fact that at times the word Berith is used in some secondary meaning, not just referring to the act of making the covenant, but the Berith may serve to denote the contents of the covenant, not the act of making the covenant, but the Berith may be focusing more on the contents of a particular covenant. And the contents could be thought of either in the form of the contents as written down, or the contents as come to expression in the actual relationship, so that the covenant can then mean not just the making of the covenant, but the actual relationship that is defined by the covenant, which is the way we use it in covenant theology, is it not? Okay, we speak about the covenant of works, the covenant of grace, and there we are talking about an actual order, a life order, a covenant order when we use the word. So observing that there is that kind of usage. And summarizing then here on page 3, converging lines of evidence have indicated then that what is designated Berith is primarily a legal disposition characteristically established by oath and defined by the terms specified in oath-bound, divinely sanctioned commitments, that just expanding the basic idea, a commitment with divine sanctions. And I skipped over a paragraph, but I think I made the point right away when we started, that the way these covenants function, the way they function is that they are instruments which are used to administer a covenant. They are instruments which express and define what the relationship is going to be, and so they function as instruments of covenant administration. And if you want to add that function to the essential definition, well, then you could do something of that sort. They are divinely sanctioned commitment arrangements, which serve as instruments of the administration of God's kingdom, and we'll be refining that a little as we go on. Now, that's the conclusion then that I came to in my study of this particular point. The way it all fell out back in the history of Westminster and Philadelphia is that John Murray used to teach the course in Old Testament biblical theology as well as the course of systematic theology. He taught that particular Old Testament course of Old Testament biblical theology. And E.J. Young, we have talked with in terms of his views of creation, was my senior colleague, and then I was a junior colleague, and the year came when John Murray decided he wasn't going to be teaching Old Testament biblical theology anymore, for whatever reason, I'm not sure. And so then the choice was up to Dr. E.J. Young to decide what to do with that course. And again, I'm not sure what reasons, but instead of taking it on himself, he asked me to do it. So it was right away at that point in trying to develop that course for the first time that I obviously then had to think seriously about this whole idea of covenant, and had to do it pretty much in relationship to John Murray, whom I had as a systematics professor as a student just a year or so before I graduated 1 year and started teaching the next one. So John Murray, who was now my colleague, had been my professor. And so I was obviously interacting in my thinking with him. And the first thing then that we'll be observing by way of other definitions of it is how Murray's view and mine differ. But then there's a second view I deal with, and the students always are in the position then to correct or think they can correct their professors, and so I was trying to correct Murray. Then subsequently, heard of Palmer Robertson. He later on was one of my students, and then he went into Old Testament studies, and I was teaching at Westminster in Philadelphia as well as other places, and he wrote a book. What is it? The Christ of the Covenant. The Christ of the Covenant study. In which, and previously I knew that he took exception to my views because he had a different concept of covenant. So here a line of professor students. We end up with a few different approaches. Read them for yourself, and you can see where the ring of truth is here. And Murray's views are available, and then in one brief little place in sort of large pamphlet-sized thing called the Covenant of Grace, where he presents his views, and as we just said, Palmer Robertson's views are available in his book, The Christ of the Covenant. So turning back now to page 3 here, I try to criticize, I don't mention them by name, I guess, do I? Oh, yes, I do. I mentioned Murray, but I didn't mention Palmer Robertson is the one I had especially in mind on the next one. So with respect to the substance of the covenant commitment, it has been held that nothing is properly, this is Murray's view, that nothing is properly called a covenant, Berith, except the sovereign administration of grace and promise. So here's an essential ingredient, according to Murray, if something's going to qualify for the term covenant. It has to involve a sovereign administration of grace and promise. Now that's a definition of the gospel. That's what the gospel is. All right. The gospel is a sovereign administration of grace and promise. And the whole gospel order comes to expression in a covenant. And so a definition of covenant, including that, would be fine if, in fact, that's the only kind of covenant we're talking about. But if we are trying to arrive at a concept of covenant and a definition of covenant that will serve our purpose as covenant theologians who are trying to encompass the whole sweep of God's kingdom administrations under the rubric of covenant, we need a definition that will fit not only the gospel order, but other places in the scripture which are labeled by Berith, and which were not sovereign administrations of grace and promise, but on the contrary, where, as traditional theology has acknowledged, involved a covenant of works. And as you well know, in the traditional covenant theology, the basic structuring is covenant of works, God's covenant with Adam, and then covenant of grace, embodying the whole gospel order, and of course with a fundamental radical contrast between the two principles of works and grace, the gospel of grace and faith. And so covenant theology had recognized that major distinction between the two, and acknowledged therefore that we are dealing with a works principle when we're dealing with the original covenant in the Bible. Now, of course, it goes beyond that, and there are other questions that places where it comes up, most notably in under the covenant of grace, as we call it. And when we come to the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Sinaitic covenant, what was the nature of that covenant? And here is the big debate in modern theology, both within the more conservative circles, but also in terms of modern scholarship and its whole concern with Paul and the law, and the literature, everyone's in it all over the place. And so these are the issues that are involved. My own analysis then of the Mosaic covenant is that it is complex, that it has a bottom there that is a continuation of the principle of grace and so on, because the covenant of grace is continuous throughout. We are not dispensationalists, but we believe in the continuity of all redemptive covenants. But nevertheless, the teaching of the Bible, as I see it, demands that there is a second overlay in the Mosaic period involving the national election of Israel to enjoy the typological kingdom, and that arrangement is governed by the principle of works, not grace. And we'll be dealing with this at great length and all the exegesis involved in it. But nevertheless, as I see it, there is another place, the whole Old Covenant, where Murray's definition doesn't work, because it was not a sovereign administration of grace and promise. If it had been, it would still be going. Israel would never have lost it. Okay, but it wasn't a sovereign administration of grace. It went down the tube. Israel lost it. The Old Covenant came to an end in the judgment of Israel. But apart from that, certainly traditionally, we all recognize that God's dealings with Adam involved a covenant of works. I hope you will see that and agree that is so. And beyond that, of course, back of history and back of the redemptive program, there is the covenant that we speak of and call various things, but the covenant between the Father and the Son, which is very much a covenant of works, where the Father commissions the Son to do something. So in history, and only as he does that, then does the Father give him the reward, is a covenant of works. So at the most fundamental key points in biblical covenant, you are not dealing with a sovereign administration of grace and promise, but you are dealing with an arrangement that is controlled by the other governing principle of works. And so my criticism of Murray's definition is a good definition for a gospel covenant, but not an adequate definition for doing covenant theology. And Murray himself realized that was the case. And now Murray at least he had a history of some change in it. But certainly at the first, he did want to recognize that God's arrangement there with Adam was one of works. He would not have gone along with the big modern problem represented by people like Dan Fuller and John Piper and others who say that there can never be an arrangement of works which involves the concept of human merit, which they regard the devilish and so on. Murray would not have gone along with that. He recognized that there would be arrangements which would be arrangements of works, and where there would be human merit that would earn a reward. But he wouldn't call that covenant. And so he saw, according to his definition, it's a contradiction in terms to speak about a covenant of works. Covenant, sovereign administration of grace and promise. How can you call it covenant of works with a contradiction in terms? And so what traditional theology had been calling covenant of works, John Murray stopped calling covenant at all. And he admits in that little pamphlet, Covenant of Grace, that he is revising. He thought it was necessary to revise the historical way of handling this, so that although he is known so much, he would speak about the Adamic administration instead of the covenant of works, and then he began to refine that somehow further, and finally was willing to admit the idea of covenant, but into that original order, but implying then that there was an element of grace in it, and that's very mischievous. To take an order that was really one of simple works, and then to begin to work in some idea of grace is to completely blur the difference between works and grace and law and gospel. And so he was partly involved in a lot of great mischief that's been going on ever since, and that came to expression in what has been the most important controversy in the history of our church or of our seminaries, but often muffled, but involving the whole thing that we know as the Sheppard Case, where Murray's successor carried on the mischief Murray started to do and carried it to a more consistent expression, and that was in the case of the theology of Norman Sheppard. So in dealing with this, you can see that we are dealing with problems that belong to us as a community of friends and seminary household here, and they won't go away by ignoring them, and we can't let the wrong errors continue to come to expression, to be festering in our midst, because it's bound to confuse and be for the ruination of the orthodoxy of the church if it's continued. So this is the kind of thing we're dealing with here, and that was my problem with Murray. We'll talk more about. The other view then was that of Palmer Robertson. Now Palmer Robertson's view was injecting into the idea of covenant not a particular principle that wouldn't apply everywhere, like sovereign grace and promise, but he insisted that all covenants had a certain consequence. And where you have a covenant, according to Palmer Robertson, you have a bond relationship, not in the sense I've been using the word bond, which was an obligation that entailed making commitments, but Palmer Robertson uses the word bond in the sense of a union, a fellowship bond, and of a deeply religious character, where a covenant is something then that produces let's see some of the language that I use here, a holy fellowship. Some suggest that the main component in the definition should be the effecting of a religious relationship, more specifically, a holy fellowship in love between God and a chosen people. So that's an essential ingredient in covenant. Again, the problem is great covenant if you're talking about gospel covenant. What the Lord is doing in the new covenant is establishing a holy fellowship in love, a religious relationship of the Lord with us, we in Christ, and so on. Great definition if that's all you're talking about, but that's not all we're talking about. We are trying to develop a comprehensive covenant theology that will handle everything, and that definition doesn't fit, and I can nail the particular point where it fails notably, is in connection with the whole area of God's common grace. We've been thinking more in terms of the administration of his kingdom, whereby he bestows his kingdom on this community or that community or so on. But then there's, after the fall, this whole area of common grace where it involves God's royal rule over the world, but not the establishing of his holy kingdom or the bestowing of that holy kingdom as an inheritance on any particular people, but where God is dealing in common with all of mankind, irrespective of believers, unbelievers, but in common with them all, and which does not contemplate in its terms the establishing of a sweet religious fellowship of God with these people. No, they are his enemies still and so on, but he is making his sun to shine, rain to fall upon them in terms of his common grace, which contemplates just the ongoing stability of this world as a platform in which redemptive history can work itself out, but which does not contemplate the actual culmination of the kingdom of God or its bestowal. And so here's a whole covenant order which simply doesn't include as an ingredient this consequence that it develops right away a religious relationship of faith and love between the two parties. That's simply not the case. And so all I'm saying then is here are a couple of definitions that would serve for the gospel covenants, but will not serve comprehensively, whereas I think the one I've suggested that all of these covenants, whether works or grace or whatever, common grace especially, all of them involve commitments with the divine sanctioning. Can't go wrong with that, and that's true to the fundamental biblical data. We take it from there.